Never thought I'd be running for Congress. We sued to see the paper ballots. We served Snipes in the Supervisor of Elections office with discovery demands through the lawsuit, and 3 days later, they destroyed every ballot cast.
I'm not a lawyer, but you're a law professor. I mean, that's got to be criminal.
For days after the election, the Broward Supervisor of Elections, Brenda Snipes, kept finding thousands of new ballots. She found thousands of ballots in a car parked at the Fort Lauderdale airport.
What made you leave the Democratic Party and go Republican?
It's like President Reagan once said. He said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, they left me. The Democratic Party, unfortunately, has lost its mind in the last few years on issue after issue. On my way here, I was listening to the news about developments in Iran. There could be a big regime change occurring in Iran. Just reminds me again that Debbie Wasserman Schultz was fine with handing over billions of dollars to the Ayatollah's regime in Iran.
We need to give people back their money, back their freedom, and make America what it once was, of a self-determined people that actually control their own destiny.
Welcome to the Carbonara for Congress podcast, where we address the real issues that affect the lives of people and families who live right here with us in South Florida.
Hi, I'm Michael Carbonara. On today's show, we have Tim Canova, law professor at Nova Southeastern University. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be here.
Thank you. And, we have something in common. We both have experience running here for Congress against Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
That's right.
So, interesting. I'm sure you have a lot of memories, good and bad. You want to tell us a little bit of background on yourself and
Sure.
How you ended up running against Debbie and maybe how you ended up at Nova?
Absolutely. Well, I grew up in New York on Long Island and became a lawyer and a law professor and moved around the country for my career. I joined the faculty at Nova Southeastern University in 2012. I teach mostly in the area of corporations, First Amendment law. Much of my writing that got me tenured deals with central banking and the Federal Reserve. Never thought I'd be running for Congress. And in 2015, I got involved with a group called the Citizens Trade Campaign, made up of labor and environmentalists, and opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. I don't know if you remember this.
Yeah, that was a big controversial issue a while back.
Exactly. And this was a big global trade agreement drafted by the Obama administration, and we were lobbying the entire Florida congressional delegation to vote against it. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz was the only Democrat in Florida's congressional delegation to vote to fast-track the TPP. And at the time, we thought we've got to find somebody who will challenge her in a Democratic primary. And at the time, I was a Democrat. I had been a lifelong Democrat. The Democrat Party looked a lot different then than it does today.
Sure.
And during the 2016 campaign, the presidential campaign, on the Democrat side, of course, Bernie Sanders was against the TPP, and Hillary Clinton helped draft it, and then she flip-flopped on it when public opinion started, especially in the Democratic Party, started to come out against the TPP. On the Republican side, Donald Trump, I think, was the only candidate out of 16 or 17 candidates against the TPP.
Yeah, it was basically NAFTA on steroids, which would just destroy our economy with those trade agreements.
Exactly. Would have outsourced millions of more American jobs and lowered our living standards and big profits for big corporations. And when Trump got in, first thing he did was he killed the TPP. So my hat was off to him for doing that. So the Citizens Trade Campaign, we were frustrated with Wasserman Schultz. She wouldn't even meet with us. And she took, I think, $330,000 from industry trade groups that wanted the TPP. So we started to look for somebody who would challenge her in a Democratic primary. And we couldn't find anyone. We approached mayors, we approached state legislators, and nobody would jump in against her because she, at the time, was the chair of the Democratic National Committee. So, one of the most powerful Democrats in the country. And it was right around the very end of 2015 that I started to realize that, let me back up and say, we had hosted a number of forums on the TPP at Nova Southeastern University, downtown Miami as well. And I would present during these forums about the TPP. And after each of the forums, people were coming up to me and trying to put the bug in my ear saying, Tim, you should run. And my attitude was, I can't run. I don't have the money to run a campaign. I'm just a law professor, you know. And at the end of 2015, I started to realize that Wasserman Schultz was so unpopular. It was so clear she was trying to block the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Yeah.
That if I were to jump in, the campaign would go viral. And that's exactly what happened. I jumped in early January 2016 for an August 30th primary. And during those 8 months, we raised $3.8 million. It was all online. I'd never picked up the phone.
Yeah, that's actually quite impressive, especially for this district.
At the time, it was a record, a national record for the highest percentage of small donations, small online donations. I think they were defined as $200 or less in any campaign for a federal office, and the donations came from all over the country, not just within the district, but they were all small donations. Wasserman Schultz tried to attack me for my campaign fundraising and saying that I was taking outside money. And I hit her right back because her outside money was all, you know, large corporate and PAC and super PAC money, really.
Yeah, the typical, powers that be, career politicians.
Exactly. And mine was from, working folks, people who are teachers and construction workers and you name it, people like our constituents here.
Yeah.
So we had, I think, over 209,000 individual donations, averaging $17 each. And with all this money that we raised, we opened up 4 field offices around the district, including in my hometown at the time, Hollywood, and in Debbie Wasserman Schultz's hometown of Weston. And with those 4 field offices, we had an enormous field operation. We were knocking on 12,000 doors a week and tracking the progress of where voter sentiment was. And just within a few weeks of the election, our numbers started to show that we reached a tipping point and we were pulling ahead decisively. And it was very exciting. It was clear on the ground wherever we went. People were coming out to vote against her. She had to resign in disgrace that summer as the chair of the DNC. That was when the WikiLeaks revealed all those emails that showed how much she was rigging the elections for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I mean, she was the head of DNC through all of that. I mean, talk about the WikiLeaks, the Seth Rich murder, stealing the primary from Bernie. I mean, that was probably one of the darkest times for the Democratic Party, and she was the leader. Exactly.
So, we were the beneficiary of that, and it certainly looked like we were about to win. And the day before the primary election, the local NBC 6 affiliate here in South Florida had up on their website a preview of the next day's elections. And for all these races, all these primary races, they had all the candidates and they all had 0 because no votes had been counted yet.
Yeah.
But mysteriously in my race, they had Wasserman Schultz beating me by 16 percentage points with, I think, 69% of the precincts reporting. And again, no precincts had reported, no votes had been counted. So we called up NBC, and they never gave an explanation. We took screenshots, they took it down. And the next day, the polls closed, and within an hour, Wasserman Schultz is declared the winner by 16 percentage points or something like that.
Big coincidence, huh?
Big coincidence. Yeah. So I just didn't concede. I didn't really... There were a number of reasons I didn't really believe the results so easily. It wasn't just the screenshot from NBC. We started getting phone calls from election experts around the country that said that they had been doing what were called cumulative voter tallies. And they showed sort of a flip of the vote was possible, maybe by algorithms of the source code of the electronic voting machines.
Yeah, very similar kind of what was, publicized, or it was made very viral in 2020, that same... I think called it the magic ballots they have there.
Exactly. It happened to Trump in 2020. It happened to Bernie Sanders throughout the primaries in 2016. And, I'm not a statistician. I don't know. So I thought the best thing we can do is to review the ballots.
Well, it was really interesting. Those machines are actually part of, manufactured in Venezuela, along with China. So
it's the Smartmatic system.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't understand why our, quote unquote, our adversaries from geopolitical positions are making the machines for our American elections.
And then when you look at the American companies involved, Dominion Voting and Election Systems and Software, ES&S, and Hart InterCivic, I started to look into those, thinking, well, who sits on the boards of directors of these companies? And it turns out that all these companies were owned by private equity in this country. So it just seemed like it was very easy to perhaps electronically fix elections.
Yeah. I know, there was a big thing where UBS was acquiring some of that portfolio, and then UBS had previously been acquired, by mainly Chinese investors.
Yeah, right. And UBS is, again, a big company. You wonder if there's an agenda, if big money is influencing these election results.
But you at least have to ask the question.
Exactly. And you're not allowed to actually inspect the source code because that's considered proprietary and trade secrets of these companies. So the only recourse we had was to ask to inspect the paper ballots, which at that time at least were considered public records. And under Florida's Public Records Acts, anyone could request to see these records. So at my own campaign expense, we put in a public records request to inspect the ballots. We thought we would inspect the ballots in maybe a dozen of the key precincts. And if they added up, if they looked like the official election results, then I would concede defeat and I would probably have endorsed her at that point. But we were never able to see the ballots. The Broward supervisor of elections at the time, Brenda Snipes was her name. She was campaigning openly with Wasserman Schultz, which you kind of have to wonder why that's happening. They're supposed to be really nonpartisan. And Brenda Snipes would not turn over the paper ballots. We sued to see the paper ballots. And we served Snipes and the supervisor of elections office with discovery demands through the lawsuit, and 3 days later, they destroyed every ballot cast. And they didn't even admit to that until a couple of months after that in sworn videotaped deposition testimony.
I'm not a lawyer, but you're a law professor. I mean, that's got to be criminal.
It is criminal. It violates state and federal statutes, and they have criminal penalties for both.
Do you have any civil recourse against something like that, or is it? I mean, you're a victim in that scenario.
I am a victim in that scenario, and I was pursuing a civil recourse, you could say. That's what our lawsuit revealed.
Okay.
And the judge at the time, he was a state judge, Judge Rag Singhal. He ruled for us. He granted a summary judgment, basically opening the door for us to receive attorney's fees. But that was it. There was no other recourse. He was not about to overturn the election. We couldn't see the ballots since they were destroyed, so they really got away with this. But there were criminal violations, and we were hoping that there would be criminal investigations and prosecutions, and that never happened. So it was a very frustrating experience. First, I should say it was a very exciting experience to have to run a campaign that goes viral, to be really hammering Wasserman Schultz on the issues. It wasn't just a critique of her as a DNC chair, but there were lots of issues on our side at the time. One of the issues was her support for President Obama's Iran nuclear deal.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we paid the price all these years because of that.
Absolutely. And I broke with the party and with the progressives, you could say, and I opposed that Iran nuclear deal at the time.
Yeah.
She was also in the pocket of payday loan companies. There were lots of issues that we were hammering her on the whole time, and she really was like a deer in the headlights at the time. I think she was really running scared.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been quite a while. She's been there 20 years. Yeah. Whatever she's doing to stay there, she's been pretty successful for a little while now. I mean, do you think this is going to catch up? How does she keep evading? I mean, you have scandal after scandal. You had the server issue with their Pakistani programmers. You have the primary issue. Yeah. She's in the Durham Annex as one of the 4 conspirators.
Yep.
So when does time catch up?
Well, what I always found frustrating was the Sun Sentinel and others would publish polls that were trying to claim that she was the most popular politician in Florida or most popular Democrat. And,
maybe for nefarious reasons.
Well, you could also manipulate polls very easily.
I mean, those recognizable names for sure.
Those polls are basically based on phone calls to 600 voters, the most likely voters, and and that's why we had much more confidence on the database we had developed on knocking on 12,000 doors a week. Much larger sample size, you could say, than these public opinion polls that I think really you could pay for those public opinion polls. And I think we still see it at the national level now.
It's a media piece. You put it out there to sway the narrative to your direction.
Exactly. I do think it will catch up to her, and hopefully with your campaign. I think it depends on the mechanics of the voting system. And I know President Trump is talking about introducing an executive order, and he's asked Congress to act with, I think, what they're calling the SAVE Act. We're still waiting for Congress to act on this. But this executive order would basically ban the electronic voting machines. It would require hand-counted paper ballots throughout the country, a one-day election day, so not a lot of early voting the way we've seen with, vote by mail, and voter ID, national voter ID, which is really overdue.
I think that's overdue. There's been a lot of rhetoric saying it's prejudice or racist to have ID to vote, but you need an ID to drive a car. You need an ID to open a bank account. You need an ID for everything. So everybody's capable of having an ID and proving who they are, especially something where you need integrity in elections. So I think you're absolutely right there. That's a no-brainer. We saw questionable things, obviously, in 2020 with the election meddling, with the machines. I think everybody expected it again in 2024, and we probably did see some in 2020, but it seemed Laura Trump really led an initiative, I think curbed a lot of that. I mean, without this executive order, can those same strategies that Laura Trump implemented nationally impact the elections here? Because people, I think, that are going to get out and vote, but they still question, is it have integrity? Does my vote count?
I think as long as we have electronic voting and the other problems, as we've identified, such as not having voter ID and having all of these vote by mail and drop boxes, things like that, there's not going to be a lot of public confidence and trust in the outcome of elections. And that's another reason that we need these reforms. We don't want a situation where anytime somebody wins an office, the opposition starts wondering if it was a stolen election or not.
Right. Yeah, I mean, people need to know, I know Trump wants to do paper ballots with watermarks, pretty much what most countries around the world have.
Exactly.
Nobody else does it the way we do with the mail-ins. And I think the executive order, I think that's probably a good idea because we never had it before. That's a relatively new thing in the last 20 years or so.
Yes. Really, the electronic voting machines spring up around 2004, right? In 2002, 2004, after the contested Bush-Gore election of 2000. But it's not been a very good experiment, you could say, to have these electronic voting machines.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer if it doesn't work in the past, don't expect it to work in the future.
Exactly.
It has to be fixed. It's broken.
Yeah.
So, what would you say for the average voter? How can they feel confidence today? Like, what do they need to do?
Well, they got to get out and vote. And I must say, personally, after what happened to me, my attitude at first was, I don't believe the outcome of my own election. Why should I vote? And yet I did end up voting. I have voted all along since then. You got to vote and cross your fingers and hope the votes are being counted, and hope that there are enough people who are watching, you could say, the supervisors of elections offices and monitoring votes, maybe doing sort of polling outside of the voter booth, outside of the voting precincts to just double check that that the outcome is the same. But again, I think I would urge people to go out and vote, but I really think we need these voting reforms very badly.
Okay. And one thing we'll do is we'll put the QR code so you can scan to register to vote by mail. So that's made available to everyone.
Fantastic.
I want to change gears a little bit here. And you said you used to be a Democrat.
Yes.
You ran as a Democrat.
Yes.
This district is pretty unique. We're a very, I would say, eclectic, diverse district. A lot of Hispanics, a lot of Jamaicans, Haitians.
A lot of independents.
A lot of independents, a lot of Democrats. Republicans are actually a minority in this district. But I think overall people, here, even though there's different parties, for the most part, most people I'd say that I meet believe in the same thing. Common sense, want to take care of their family, have a good job, have a home. The fundamentals of what we want in America is the same across all parties.
Absolutely.
What made you leave the Democratic Party and go Republican?
It's like President Reagan once said. He said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, they left me. And that's how I feel. And that's how a lot of folks who have left the Democratic Party in the last few years feel. It's not the Democratic Party that I grew up with. I grew up on Long Island. I went to a high school named after John F. Kennedy. And I used to consider myself a John F. Kennedy kind of a Democrat. In fact, in 2016, my campaign slogan was Progress for All, which was John F. Kennedy's campaign slogan in 1960 when he ran for president. And to be a progressive then, it wasn't talking about things like transgenderism. It was bread and butter issues. It was, making sure that the American people were well taken care of, that everybody worked, and that there was a good standard of living, and that we had secure borders and a good national defense, and that we stood for freedom. And the Democratic Party, unfortunately, has lost its mind in the last few years on issue after issue. And we see
everything you just said, Debbie fights for those things, actually.
Exactly.
The
She
TPP,
fights for an open border.
Open border, defund the police.
That's right.
Everything that the Democratic Party used to represent, Debbie is basically attacking that today.
Exactly.
So that makes sense. I think, everybody wants just common sense freedom in this country, and they're just sick and tired of the rhetoric.
Absolutely. And you see this throughout Florida and even throughout the country. More and more people are leaving the Democratic Party and actually registering Republican. So I do think that there's a lot of reason to be very hopeful that this might be the year to take down Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Mm-hmm. She's so unpopular that she's got to be careful where she even goes in public. And I saw this in 2016. People were pretty much booing and harassing her wherever she went. She was so unpopular. So, I don't believe this canard that somehow she's such a popular figure that she can't be taken down.
I agree with you. And I think, I've met even Democrats that they don't particularly like her, but they just vote along party lines because they're looking for something different, but they're just waiting for it to show up.
That's right.
And I think, good chance you probably did win that election, but there was so much meddling going on, I don't think we'll ever find out. If Brenda Snipes actually destroyed ballots, that tells you exactly right there, where there's smoke, there's fire.
That's right. And she didn't destroy a few ballots. She destroyed every ballot cast in that race.
And she's never been held accountable for that.
In fact, I'll say this, that we were hoping that the governor at the time, Rick Scott, would fire her, would remove her as a supervisor of elections. And beyond that there would be criminal investigations. And we tried to get the Florida Department of Law Enforcement involved and the Attorney General's office. And none of them would touch it, which seemed very strange to me. My campaign lawyer, who had a lot of experience in Florida politics, I said to him, why aren't the Republicans stepping forward to try to do something about this and investigate? After all, they've been basically, they're scandal after scandal where the Broward supervisor of elections were harming Republicans. And he got back to me and he said that I couldn't really expect any help from the Republicans. He had made calls and looked into it. And this is a sad state of politics in general, and it's not just a critique of the Republicans. My lawyer said that it turns out that the establishment of the Republican Party had the same financial backers that Wasserman Schultz did. And I think this is why Donald Trump poses such a threat to not just the Democrat establishment, but even, so-called rhinos in the Republican Party.
Sure, and he certainly changed it from that point to now. And I think everybody, especially social media, people became much more aware, much more engaged. Thinking back, me growing up, people watch the news on TV and they know what's going on, but for the most part, nobody really paid attention until Donald Trump actually ran. And that combined with social media, I think what we're seeing now is people actually seeing the fraud or the corruption or just the same old thing that's been ruining their lives, but they never really, it wasn't in their face before, so it was kind of out of sight, out of mind.
That's right.
People are actually really engaged now because they see how much it affects their daily lives.
They are. And, when I speak to family and friends of mine who are still Democrats and they don't understand why I left the party, I try to engage them in the issues. And on issue after issue, it turns out that they're aligned with me and actually with Donald Trump on many of these issues. But they have been so programmed to just hate the person, to hate Donald Trump, that they can't get past that. So, our experience was we were frustrated that there was no criminal investigations of the Broward supervisor of elections. And in fact, at the very end of Rick Scott's time as governor in 2018, he was running for the U.S. Senate against Bill Nelson, who was the incumbent Democrat. And Ron DeSantis was running for governor against Andrew Gillum. Both those races for governor and for senator crash landed in Broward County and Palm Beach County. They were like too close to call. And for days after the election, the Broward supervisor of elections, Brenda Snipes, kept finding thousands of new ballots. She found thousands of ballots in a car parked at the Fort Lauderdale airport.
Oh my God! And they accept that. That's just
it was
absurd.
It was outrageous. And I was on cable TV 3 mornings in a row, including Fox actually, and they wanted to ask me about my race. Suddenly, people remembered what had happened to me because of what the supervisor of elections of Broward County had done. And my message was, anyone who would destroy every ballot cast in a high-stakes congressional primary. How could you trust the thousands of ballots that she's suddenly finding?
Yeah.
Okay, and both those races came out for the final result. Of course, was Ron DeSantis won as governor, and Rick Scott became a senator. And on Rick Scott's way out as governor, just weeks later, he removed Brenda Snipes from office. And in his executive order removing her, he listed a whole bunch of crimes and malpractices she had committed, and the destruction of the ballots in my race was point number one. Why the reasons for her being removed as supervisor of elections. Now, we were then hoping that there'd be criminal investigations. Unfortunately, when Ron DeSantis came in as governor, he reinstated her, and she ended up then retiring on a $135,000 a year pension.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, which was really frustrating. And I think it was about a year and a half ago that Brenda Snipes passed away. So no justice came there. But it wasn't just Brenda Snipes. She had one of her top lieutenants who actually carried out the destruction order. But at this point, the statute of limitations has expired on prosecuting criminally anyone for those crimes. We also tried to engage the U.S. Justice Department to investigate. And I had a conversation with the interim U.S. attorney at the time, Ben Greenberg, and he was very interested. Like I said, when you have evidence like videotaped sworn deposition testimony admitting to the crime, a second-year law student could prosecute that. And he realized that. And he went up to Washington, D.C. for a week of meetings at the Justice Department and came back, and suddenly it was too complex a case for him to bring charges. And that didn't make a lot of sense. I think a couple of years later, speaking with the late Pete Antonacci, who Governor DeSantis had appointed to try to clean up the Broward supervisor's office. He had told me that the reason that the U.S. attorney was not going to prosecute was it was killed by Rod Rosenstein, who was the deputy attorney general in Washington, D.C., the same Rod Rosenstein who had appointed Bob Mueller to investigate President Trump on, the Russian collusion charges.
Right.
Yeah.
It's politics.
It's politics, exactly. Yeah. It's a dirty business at times. It shouldn't be. We try to stay focused on the issues. That's what the voters really care about. And it's a shame that there's, this kind of corruption that's embedded within the system.
How do you think we can fix it? Like, what do we do? I'm running not as a career politician, but I really want to affect and bring about change and restoring our freedoms that we've been losing because people are voting for things like the TPP and the Paris Accords and things like that. How do we fix it? Like, how does the average person get out and say, my voice be heard? What do we do to bring integrity?
I think exactly what you're doing, Michael. I mean, somebody has to always step up and run for office, and it's fantastic that you're doing that. And the voters have to realize that while the system is broken, the only tools we have are the vote. I have a lot of hope that between now and November, there are going to be big changes to our voting system. And it's either going to be an executive order and a declaration of a national emergency by the president, or Congress is going to finally act. But I do think before these midterm elections, the voting system is going to look a lot different, and people will have a lot more confidence, I think, a lot more reason to trust the outcome of these elections, and therefore a lot more reason to get out there and vote.
Yeah, I think, we're going to be in a spotlight again. It seems to be Broward's always in the spotlight of all the elections. Everything from, Bush and everything, to the last 20 years, really. Even, just like you said, even DeSantis and Gillum. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of talk. DeSantis just made a statement last week that he's calling for a redistricting of the state. Yes. And, of course, I'm sure that's going to be met with lawsuits and a fight and things like that. And, we don't know where the lines are going to be drawn. But, again, Broward is, I think, right there in the middle of everything.
I think it is. And I don't think the district will disappear. Florida is a growing population. We're not about to remove congressional districts. But I think at the end of the day, it might look a lot different. And it might not be so heavily weighted towards the Democrats. I think there'll be a lot more higher percentage of independents and even Republicans in this district by the time you're on the ballot in November.
Yeah, I think you're right. so many people from New York and other states came down here during COVID. And I heard, most of the people that actually came down during COVID were Republicans. I think there was like 900,000 in 1 year, actually.
From New York and also New Jersey, another 500,000 from there. And now with Mayor Mamdani in Manhattan.
Yeah, people are actually coming here for freedom because Florida 20 years ago was pretty Democrat, but over the years, this has become like the beacon of freedom for the rest of the country.
Absolutely.
And I think some of the things we see is, we have economically, we were the best state. We have a completely capped rainy day fund. I think the quality of life here is better because of the freedom we've had here. And, it's something that we need to continue, and we need to get people out like Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is doing the complete opposite. The things that she votes for and she promotes are pretty much aligned with the socialism of Mamdani. And I think people don't realize that. I mean, people that have been voting for her, like I said, I think they're voting her because of the Democratic name.
I think so too.
But the policies, they're far, far beyond any Democrat policies. They're actually socialist.
Yes, I know. And the issues really are not going away. I mean, Florida residents have real challenges right now meeting their bills. Rents and mortgages are very expensive at this point. Housing prices are very high. Food prices. I mean, there was a lot of inflation in those Biden years.
Yeah.
Things are turning around now. And I think on issue after issue, Wasserman Schultz is out of step with public opinion. I mean, to still be championing boys and girls sports, men and women's sports, open borders, things like that, it's just completely out of touch, not just with the voters, but with really what needs to be done in this country to make this country strong again and to help us move forward.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Everything she's doing and has been doing has led to this affordability problem we have in this country. What she's been doing, I mean, she wants universal Medicaid for the whole country. That's going to bankrupt us. We can't afford that. And when you have subsidized the big industries, that's where you get all the fraud.
Well, it's interesting to see what President Trump has proposed. He wants to get rid of the Obama Unaffordable Care Act subsidies that are going to very large health insurance companies. And instead, he wants to give it back to American citizens and give us the freedom to spend those subsidies however we'd like. I would like to see among the options that if we get those subsidies back personally, that we could buy into the Medicare system perhaps, so that you don't have to be 65 to be suddenly eligible for Medicare, and let the private insurance companies have to actually compete with Medicare. I think that would be an interesting idea.
Yeah, for me, I mean, anything with more competition creates better quality and lowers the cost. I mean, that's basic economics, but people forget that because we have lobby groups or politicians that really don't understand how things work, and they end up subsidizing big industry, and that raises the price and lowers the quality for everybody. And we need to get back to giving it back to the people, giving them more options. People are complaining from Debbie Wasserman's camp saying that we need to increase the subsidies on Obamacare. But that's what Obamacare is what made it unaffordable to begin with. So why are you going to increase the problem?
Exactly. And, those subsidies under Obamacare, they ended up going to the health insurance companies, and the premiums are so much higher now than they were in 2010, before Obamacare was passed. So, she's got the wrong approach on a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of exciting changes happening in Washington, D.C. right now. You take a look at the housing affordability problem, and you see we have a president who's trying to push the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. Lower interest rates would certainly help make housing more affordable. It would make mortgages more affordable. And President Trump just declared that he's going to have an executive order that's going to prevent large institutional investors and big money managers like BlackRock and Blackstone and State Street from basically buying single-family residential homes.
No, I think that's a great thing, and I don't think many people realize how much BlackRock actually owns in this country. I think the latest statistic I saw is, I think 1 out of every 4 single-family homes. That's
amazing. Is it that high, really?
Yeah, and that's what's making it unaffordable, because it's turning Americans into renters.
Yeah.
And when you have, they're not selling, so that dries up the market supply and increases the cost for everyone else.
And that's been the agenda of the globalists, actually. You look at the World Economic Forum and the messages that they've been putting out for several years now. They want everyone in the world to be renters and not
everybody
not
to have nothing and be happy by the year 2030.
Exactly. So I mean, that's a disaster kind of socialist.
That's why things are hyper focused right now, because we're approaching those timelines.
That's right.
And those are actual written policies. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's actually written policy. And so we're really in a fight right now of America first, supporting American people, or supporting big corporations. We need to give people back their money, back their freedom, and make America what it once was, of a self-determined people that actually control their own destiny.
That's right. You know, when you take a look at what John Kennedy was fighting when he was in office as president, he was against a lot of this globalist agenda. And people don't realize that, because Kennedy was, you could say, an internationalist. He believed the United States needed to be engaged internationally. But he was really for America first. He wanted this country to be strong at home, to be able to have influence abroad, and to be strong abroad, and to carry the banner of freedom abroad.
Yeah. I mean, America's always had a strong foreign policy since George Washington. You know, every president has been engaged in foreign policy. I mean, the world's getting smaller and smaller, so it's okay to have foreign policy. Obviously, we want trade with as many countries as we can, but we need to take care of the people at home, which is most important.
That's right, and that's why trade has to be on very fair terms. You know, if Bernie Sanders, think about this, if Bernie Sanders had been elected president in 2016, and he had come into office and killed the Trans-Pacific Partnership and started to use tariffs to change the terms of trade with our trading partners so that we didn't have chronic trade deficits, the left would be applauding all of this.
Yeah.
There's a lot that Trump has been doing that really has needed to be done for quite a while. Obama would give rhetorical support for the idea of rebalancing our trade relations, but he never did anything about it. So, you know, a lot of people can look at the Democrats and sometimes think, well, they sound good on some issues, but what about their actions?
The policy of the Democrats, from a speaking perspective, let's take care of all the people that need help. That's a great thing, and we should be taking care of the people who can't help themselves. But at the end of the day, you can't keep taxing the working class to the point where you bleed them dry and you make everybody poor.
That's right.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
And you can't, quote unquote, tax. There's not enough rich people to tax to take care of everyone. The numbers don't add up. That's a fallacy.
Yeah.
And secondly, if you overtax, those people move their businesses somewhere else.
That's right.
And we've got to remember that those big businesses, and I'm not talking about the BlackRock that's taking advantage of people. I'm talking about the average businesses that are, you know, mom and pop shops to a little bit bigger. You know, I want to give Elon Musk an example. You know, he's worth, I don't know, $400 billion.
And he's about to get a $1 trillion pay package.
But he's not out there taking, that's not $400 billion cash. He's taking that money, investing in businesses, hiring employees, creating productivity and value, and giving people jobs. If you take that money away to give to the government, they just tax it and spend it. They don't actually create value or help people.
Yeah.
So the private sector needs to be supported, and we need to support businesses that are actually doing good for America.
I agree with you on that. You know, Obama issued an executive order that basically said any company that, it had a lot of loopholes, but any company that does business with the federal government has to pay a certain federal minimum wage. I think it was like $11 an hour. So it gave the appearance that he cared about the working poor and he was trying to do something to help them. But that's a dagger in the heart of small businesses, to be paying a federal minimum wage.
Well, here's a really good example of that. New York City increased their minimum wage 3 years ago. What they did, reaction, because businesses, even corporations like McDonald's, they couldn't handle paying that high of a minimum wage for that certain jobs. So McDonald's fired most of their staff and put in kiosk ordering systems.
Right, right.
So if you make a minimum wage higher than the market rate, you're going to force that business to either fire people or close down.
So it seems to me that part of the problem is the ratio of sort of the C-suite, you know, the CEO, CFO, to their rank and file workers. And Trump is beginning to address this with the defense industries, actually. He's talked about not allowing them to do stock repurchases because they're really playing with public money. You know, and many of these companies are. Tesla would not be as successful as it is right now, or SpaceX, if not for federal subsidies. And most of the companies that are doing real well, they do have these federal subsidies. So can they bring their ratio of CEO pay to rank and file worker pay down? Right now, it's something like 500 to 1, whereas in the 1960s, it was like 30 to 1. Most of the rest of the world is 20, 30, 40 to 1.
Yeah.
So it has led me to start scrutinizing how are these companies setting their CEO pay. Quite often, it's boards of directors that are handpicked by the CEO. So there's not really a free market in the setting of executive compensation. I'd like to see more attention on that and discussions about that, how we can reduce this disparity between the very top executive compensation and what they're paying their working folks.
Are you saying that for all companies, or companies that are public, or companies that are maybe
public
relying
companies
on government subsidies to exist?
Public companies that do business with Uncle Sam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that perspective, I get it, because you're using taxpayer money to be successful.
Exactly.
And that needs to, it's essentially, you wouldn't exist. Now, I know Tesla, I think they had a $500 million loan from the government when they first started, and they did pay it back actually in full. It was one of the only few loans that the government did get paid back. But yeah, they probably wouldn't exist, because it takes tremendous amount of money to launch a company like that, that's scalable, that's high tech, that is now, I think, one the largest American car manufacturer.
And many of the big tech companies really benefited from research and development by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
Google's a big recipient of that.
Google, Meta, Facebook, Amazon, all of these companies wouldn't be successful the way they are today. So one thing that concerns me is sort of the cartelization of the American economy, that in industry after industry, there's just 3 or 4 or just a handful of firms that are dominating. When we talk about a capitalist system, what do we mean by capitalism? We mean private ownership, which is great that we have private ownership in this country, but it also means a free market. And to what degree are some of these markets sort of being rigged by big cartels? I think there needs to be a lot of scrutiny of that. And I think there is more attention about it. And these are the kinds of issues that, Congress needs to be engaged in. And unfortunately, for the past few years, the kinds of issues that Congress deals with are what? Just, impeachments and things like that. Just the politics of personal vilification.
Yeah.
I should mention that when I ran in 2016, I spoke to somebody who had just been elected, a freshman in Congress. And I asked him what it was like being a freshman there. And he said that when he first got up to Capitol Hill, he was told by his party leadership, and he was a Democrat, but it was the same with the Republicans, that if he wants to be on a certain committee, he's got to raise this much money for the party. So if you want to be in the finance or the banking committee, $200,000 for the party. Maybe the energy committee, $100,000. I can't remember what the exact figures were. And his response was, I just went through an expensive campaign. I don't have any money left for this. Where am I going to get the money from? And he was told, don't worry. We have call centers right there on Capitol Hill. And in fact, the Democrat call center was in the same building as the Republican call center. And you can call up and, spend time dialing for dollars. And he said, who am I going to call? And he was told, don't worry about that. If you want to be on the banking committee, we've got a list of CEOs and lobbyists for Wall Street. They're expecting your call. And same with the energy industry, and same with big pharma and big tech. Well, it turns out that the average member of Congress is now spending 35 hours a week dialing for dollars. They don't have time to legislate. They don't have time to even study the bills they're voting on. So they just end up voting the way the party leadership tells them to vote. That's not representing the people.
No, it's setting for failure. Yeah. And then they get stuck in this trap. Okay, well, now they accept the money from this person or this organization, and then they get called out for it. And it sounds like a lot of them are just trying to survive, and they're not realizing what they signed up for, that there's this bureaucracy, this swamp that they need to fight against.
That's right. So
the cards are stacked against the average person trying to do the right thing.
It really is. Even the average person who goes up to Capitol Hill with good intentions. So, I mean, it's important to sort of analyze and recognize what some of these problems are. And then even when you start identifying the problems, then it's a big challenge. What are the solutions?
Yeah.
This is a system that has a lot of momentum. And how do you start changing that system?
Well, for me, what I've seen, like I said, talking about social media and people being engaged, is shining a light on things that are always kept secretive. And I don't mean that way in exposing confidentiality and anything like that, but I'm saying most people are not aware of how these systems work, how money's spent, where money comes from. And the more the general public knows, the more transparency there is, it usually makes people more honest because they know they're being watched or people are complaining.
That's right. Sunshine is the great disinfectant. I think that's what Louis Brandeis had once said. And look what's being revealed in Minnesota and now in some other states. I think that's the tip of an iceberg where taxpayer money has been going in the
moment somebody
billions.
sees one person, one social media report, Nick Hurley showed up. Nobody else showed up.
That's right.
One person showed up. And within a week, it was all exposed.
Yeah.
It just shows you one person. It's always one person that makes a difference.
Yeah, that's right. And we all have to have the courage to stand up and be that one person.
Yeah. So yeah, this is uphill battle. I mean, it's funny. I actually heard similar stories about the committees too. So I mean, that's not a unique story at all. Right. I've been told the same exact thing.
Yeah. Well, that's what you're going to be heading into after November.
I'm going to just hodl my Bitcoin and wait for it to go up.
Exactly. Well, these are exciting times. On my way here, I was listening to the news about developments in Iran. There could be a big regime change occurring in Iran. And again, it just reminds me again that Debbie Wasserman Schultz was fine with handing over billions of dollars to the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. What's the rationale of that? It never made any sense. No sense.
And the whole world's paying for that right now. The whole Middle East, Israel, America are paying the price for voting for the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, exactly. But things are changing. I think this is 2026 is bound to be a year of lots of great changes.
I agree. Having that sunlight being the great disinfectant, I truly believe X being, a scalable social media platform that's actually very news driven, not so much social driven, I think is basically a way for America to export the idea of free speech around the world, even with places where you don't have free speech. So people are getting access to ideas that they may not know you're allowed to even have those thoughts or those things are even possible.
And this is the American way. And when I have these conversations, like with family and friends who don't understand why I would leave the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party has become the party of censorship over the last few years. They were censoring anyone who had a different view of COVID, of the vaccines, of politics, you name it. We should not be about censorship. The First Amendment is first for a reason. Yeah. And Elon Musk just, I think he tweeted recently, he posted on X recently, about the efforts that are going on in Europe, led by England, I believe, by Britain, to try to deplatform X.
To me, you either have free speech or you have tyranny. There's no middle ground.
Yeah. I'm a complete agreement, and I teach First Amendment law, so I certainly appreciate the value of free speech, not just for personal fulfillment, that we should all, as human beings, be free to speak our minds, but sort of for the marketplace for ideas. The political system won't work if there's censorship. It'll just be tyranny dressed up as democracy, but not really a democracy.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So, Thomas, you ran in 2016. It was, I guess, a mess. You can call it that.
Yeah.
What have you done since? What's kind of been your world since that election?
So I did run in 2018 as an independent, and we had one poll that the Floridian Press, I think it was, published that showed a neck and neck, and it turned out that we got clobbered. But the distribution of the votes was very fishy. It was like we got capped at the same small percentage in every district and among every demographic group, which again suggested rigged algorithms. So after that, I gave up on running for office. And every now and then I get folks that'll say, you got to run for office again. And I think if I ran for dog catcher, they would perhaps be rigging the machines against me if that's what they're doing.
It's a tough battle. Yeah, I mean, it's a full-time job. It's funny. Campaigning is a full-time job before you even get the job. It's basically a job interview for 18 months or so.
Totally. And my hat's off to you and everyone else who is willing to put yourself out there and to do that kind of hard work. For me, since then, I've really focused my attention on my teaching. I'm a law professor at Nova Southeastern University. I teach First Amendment law, as I mentioned. I teach corporations and corporate governance. I write a lot about central banking. I've been a critic of the Federal Reserve for many years, not just its monetary policy, but also its governance structure, which many, not just myself, believe is very unconstitutional on its face. And it's an exciting time to be teaching these courses right now. Just look at the Federal Reserve. The president's going to name a new Federal Reserve chairman. At the same time, there's litigation that's right up at the Supreme Court about whether the president can fire a Federal Reserve governor who apparently was lying about her mortgages. So this brings in the whole theory of the unitary executive and constitutional jurisprudence.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are now finding out, and they're upset. Again, how do I affect it? That our Federal Reserve is a completely private company.
Yeah, exactly.
And how come the president doesn't have oversight? How come the Congress doesn't have oversight? How come they've never been audited?
And this is, you could say, a recurring battle throughout American history. You had the first Bank of the United States, which had a 20-year charter. This is what makes the Federal Reserve even more egregious, is that it's not limited to a 10 or a 20-year charter. It's perpetual existence. And that first Bank of the United States, I should fast forward to the second Bank of the United States, which was 1816 to 1836, and President Andrew Jackson vetoed its recharter. And that veto statement really sounds like a critique of today's Federal Reserve, that it's influenced by foreigners, by foreign financial interests, that it's not accountable to the American people or to Congress in any significant way. So these are discussions that I think we need to be having, and we're beginning to have. And I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah, it's the ability to control your own issuance of money is the basics of freedom. Our founding fathers talked about that even well before Jackson.
That's right.
And that was a big part of our war. We were printing our own money before King James said, King George said, not anymore.
I've studied various periods of American history for, you could say, monetary policy and currency creation. What happened during the U.S. Civil War is very interesting. We didn't have a central bank at the time. We didn't even have a federal income tax. The government was only raising money through tariffs. And the war breaks out, and I think we only had less than 20,000 federal troops, U.S. troops in the Army. Within 3 years, we'd have 1 million. So how do you scale up? You need money to scale up.
Yeah.
So Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury, Salmon Chase, approached the private bankers of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia to see if they would basically lend money to the federal government. And they said they would, but for like 20% interest rates. So Congress responded with 3 legal tender acts, which authorized the Treasury Department not to borrow money, not to borrow currency, but to issue currency directly. And these were the greenbacks, or the United States notes.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting alternative system to what we have now. Because when you look at today's public finances, the Treasury is spending over $1 trillion a year now just in interest on the national debt.
Yeah.
For currency that we have a sovereign right to issue, and if not spend into circulation, you can even lend it into circulation. The federal government could be making a small interest on lending the money into circulation.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's a lot more tools that we should be exploring as a government, and all of that translates into better quality life and more wealth for every American. And I don't think we need to be striving for affordability. We need to be striving for prosperity.
Prosperity. And, it's fascinating to see what Bessent is doing at the Treasury Department now, and what the Trump administration is doing. So they've used tariffs as a negotiating tool for bargaining position. And they've used it to get commitments from foreign countries, to recycle their surpluses, you can say. They're sitting on major dollar holdings from having chronic trade surpluses because we've had unfair trade. And now we've got, something like $17-18 trillion of commitment of new investment into the United States from these foreign powers. So that's going to help our prosperity right there. And that's not monetary policy. That's using tariffs to help investment in the economy.
Yeah. No, you're right. There's lots of tools. We can be creative. You need business people that understand economics to actually take initiative saying we need to fix this, and not just react by taxing to solve problems.
Well, and that's become the Democrat approach, is just to raise taxes and, then take a look at their spending. So much of it is going to these non-governmental organizations. And we shouldn't even be calling them non-governmental because most of their funding is coming from
proxies, essentially.
Yeah.
But, I was really excited to see, about a week ago, I saw Marco Rubio, or maybe longer, Marco Rubio made a statement that they're canceling all deals with healthcare NGOs around the world.
Oh, wow.
The government will do it directly. We don't need a middleman to take all the money.
Yeah, because you use those they've been using those NGOs to escape transparency and to escape any kind of constitutional accountability.
Yeah. Yeah, so the whole thing needs to be cleaned up. We need to just kind of, for me, a clean slate, get rid of the bureaucracy, actually have programs that help people that actually need it, that can't help themselves. But for the most part, we need to focus on American people, working people, giving back their money that they've been working for. You shouldn't be taxed 30-40% and then come home, pay a home, property tax, pay taxes for everything, gasoline tax. Americans have more taxes than any other country in the world. Yeah. It's just, there's no way to get ahead that way.
So by restoring national sovereignty, you could say, and respecting the sovereignty of states, this is a completely different alternative model to the globalist model, which is really just hoping that these global trade agreements are somehow going to trickle down and help our working folks in this country, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
And it's a model, I should say, putting America first, taking care of your own citizens, having national sovereignty. That becomes a model for other countries around the world, because we're not the only country that's run down this globalist path and has ignored the needs of their own citizens.
Well, I think people got to realize, and maybe politicians don't realize this, but human capital is your greatest resource. If you empower every citizen, if you build up the middle class, you're going to have more innovation, you're going to have more businesses, you're going to have more of everything that makes quality of life, because as you bleed people dry, they all become dependent on the government, and they're not producing anything, they're not innovating, they're not creating businesses.
That's right.
When you empower people, everything becomes better.
So a program that helps economic development through freedom for small businesses, that doesn't rely just on gigantic cartels, that is exactly the path to prosperity. And, they used to call it the American system throughout the 1800s, without a central bank, a privatized central bank, and using protective tariffs and investment in infrastructure and freedom. That's what made this country so great throughout the 1800s and into the Industrial Revolution.
I think it's been so long that the average person doesn't realize how we operated pre-Federal Reserve and used tariffs in the past. That's what exactly what you said made us great back then and prosperous. And I think many people think change is scary because you don't know what's on the other side. And normally when you have any types of change, that transition period is always a little rocky. But once you get past that, that's providence. That's where you need to be, because ultimately that's, nothing is made to be easy. There's going to be some hard work to get there. That's
true. And when you say the average American doesn't understand this, well, first of all, the average American is not taught their own history and their own civics, K to 12 for the most part at this point. The school system, it's sad to see what's happened with our education system. And then beyond K to 12, just at sort of, the university and the postdoctoral level, there's a real crisis among you could say the economics and finance fields in what they're teaching. It's a very orthodox model that they've been teaching for many years. And Trump is exploding this model, and it's forcing us to think anew about the way we structure our financial institutions and our economy.
Yeah. So you're pretty well versed in everything. You've run before. You have a very good feel what's going on in Congress and the government. What would you do if you were in Congress today? What were some of the things that you would do to restore freedom, to make it more prosperous for Americans, for Floridians?
I do think the Federal Reserve has to be reformed completely.
And what do you mean by reformed? Like nationalize it?
Yes, I think at the very least. There's no reason that we should be delegating monetary powers, monetary authority to, it's not just a board of governors. A lot of people don't realize the way the Fed is even structured. They think, there's a chairman of the Federal Reserve and he's appointed by the president, therefore there's some kind of accountability. Well, the 7 members of the Board of Governors are appointed for 14-year terms. There's no other federal officers that have 14-year terms. And those 7 governors don't make monetary policy alone. They sit in a room with the 12 presidents of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks that are all privately owned. So why should they be in the room, but the American people are not in the room? Why big bankers that, are international financiers essentially, but not American workers? So, yeah, I think the structure of governing the central bank needs to be reformed. I am in favor of public banking to some degree. I've studied the New Deal period, and not everything that the New Deal did was so terrible. I look at my dad's generation. My dad was part of the GI generation, the World War II generation, the greatest generation. And a lot of folks don't realize how significant that generation was for transforming the American economy and creating a vibrant middle class and a lot of freedom here at home. The GI Bill of Rights gave to every returning veteran, and even the scale of this people don't realize. There were 16 million Americans who served in uniform in World War II. That's 16 million Americans who suddenly were eligible for GI Bill of Rights benefits after World War II. Those benefits included tuition-free higher education with living stipends, low-interest mortgage loans, Veterans Administration health benefits, and Have I missed anything? I guess those are pretty good,
Those
right?
are.
Oh, and low interest business loans to start their own businesses. That created a boom in the middle class right there, okay? Now, I don't think we should just try to recreate that out of thin air and just give those kinds of benefits with nothing in return. Because those GIs who came back from World War II, they had put in 3 years on average of hard fighting and service to their country. If you had a national service program in this country where an 18-year-old who graduates from high school is given the opportunity to serve for 2 or 3 years in a civilian kind of a program or military at their choosing, what would a civilian program look like? Well, perhaps like the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s and 40s, they could clear the underbrush and manage the forests and make sure that we don't lose 4 million acres a year to forest fires.
Yeah, well, every year we see devastations.
Every year. So all
Especially in California, I mean, it's devastated.
Devastating. All those people who complain about global warming and climate change. Well, it doesn't do much for climate change, if you're burning 4 million acres a year or more. The trees are there to absorb carbon and to give us oxygen, okay? Mm-hmm. They could be serving their country in changing bedpans in hospitals and bringing down healthcare costs. And then if they've served for 2 or 3 years for their country, then give them a tuition-free higher education or trade school. It doesn't have to be universities. Universities right now are so heavily subsidized, and look what they've done with it. They've created these ideological factories.
Yeah, no, you're right there. And I think people are looking for different answers. And there's been other things that work, just like you're saying. But I think there needs to be milestones. But if we're going to be investing money, invest it with our American people.
That's right.
I agree. Don't invest it in foreign operations. Don't invest it in these crazy programs. People here need it.
I used to be, you could say, a supporter of a lot of foreign aid, and I would look at the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe after World War II. But reality sets in, and you start taking a look that many of these government programs have become opportunities for money laundering, basically, on an international scale.
There's also unintended consequences too with how some foreign aid's given, and it's not really talked about. And I'll give you a really good example. The U.S. gives foreign aid, and they'll give away food, like especially to subsidize the corn industry, the corn farmers. And the corn farmers were paid a guaranteed price for their crop, and the U.S. would take it, and they would actually give her free as foreign aid to countries around the world.
That's right.
And they gave this for free in Mexico and other places. And corn was one of the biggest cash crops of Mexico.
Wiped out
all the Mexican farmers.
Almost 1 million farm families.
They all had to move to Mexico City and get city jobs. Yeah. And they basically took back, the government took the entire coastline of Mexico and turned it to tourism destinations. Yeah. But they robbed all those Mexican farmers of their land. But it was unintended consequences of America giving away free corn.
And NAFTA only exacerbated this problem. The North American Free Trade Agreement created incentives for these maquiladoras, these factories along the U.S.-Mexico border in northern Mexico. But then within just a few years, we let China into the World Trade Organization, and the maquiladoras collapsed, and all those jobs basically were outsourced to China. So the whole free trade blueprint, the whole free trade agenda has been a disaster for working folks, not just in the U.S., but all over the world.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't really free trade. It was orchestrated a way for big corporations to save money.
Exactly.
And we pay for it.
That's right. Yeah.
So everything's been doing the exact opposite what is needed for the American people. And not just America, but the whole world has been doing that, where you have corporations and you have corrupt politicians driving policy that just bleeds the citizens dry. And we just need to give people back their freedom, back to be able to make their own businesses, have economic opportunity, because these situations are actually drying up that opportunity. That's why we have a whole generation too of Gen Z kids and even millennials that are broke, and they don't have any prospect of the American dream of owning a home. And if you can't own a home, you're not going to be able to have a family and have kids. Yeah. And it's a whole problem that's cyclical, and it's all dependent on having the ability to have a good paying job. But how do you have a good paying job with these policies in place that just pull the rug out from underneath you and fill you with debt?
And one of the issues we haven't really talked about is immigration and the open borders. You go into African-American communities, for instance, low-income African-American communities. They've been hurt terribly by these open borders. It depresses the wages for low income working folks, basically. So we have to be putting our own citizens first. We have to be finding ways to have a free market economy that works, that has an environment where people can start their own businesses.
Well, the H-1Bs is another scam. I'm all for bringing the best of the best, but that's not what we had. Nikola Tesla basically came here because, he was a genius, and we wanted the best of the best. But we're not getting that. We're getting a corrupt, basically a circumvention of outsourcing. Yeah, they're bringing onshore the outsourced low labor work, and that's taking away jobs. People are going to college for a skilled job, a technical job, and they get out thinking they're going to get a job at Google or Amazon or one of these big companies, and they can't because
they're competing with people who are here under the H-1B.
Exactly. Yeah. So all these policies are working against the American people, and it's a fraud. It's a scam, and we need to fix it.
Yeah. Well, and the first freedom, of course, is the freedom to speak about these issues. And you can't solve the issues if we don't have real, vibrant public discussions and debates about it. Yeah. And I applaud you for doing this podcast and for having a regular podcast, because that's what it represents, is to start having these conversations and opening people's eyes to the problems and trying to figure out collectively what the solutions are.
Yeah, I think everybody's ready for change. They know there's answers out there. They're looking for something to happen now. They're sick and tired of it. They're ready for the old guard of career politicians to go out the door and new people bring some life to help everyone.
It's true. And you look at the career politicians. I mean, some of them have been up there on Capitol Hill. You mentioned Wasserman Schultz for 20 years, and there's others who have been there for 30 or 40 years.
Well, she's also a good example because she's never even had a job in the private sector.
She's never done anything else. Absolutely.
Literally lived off the backs of American taxpayers.
Yes, absolutely. And actually now I see she's one of the top insider traders. She's gotten wealthy.
I think she's doing a lot more insider trading lately because I think she knows her time's up. Yeah. And she's trying to make it last while she can.
Exactly. I think so.
But Tim, it's been a great conversation. It was actually very enlightening. I think I appreciate some of your insight, especially on the bank and the Federal Reserve. That is where I think the precipice of all of our issues is where we get our money.
I think so.
And so thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. And good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed today's show. It's available on replay, so click the like and subscribe button and forward it around to your friends. Let them get involved too. Remember, to really make your voice heard, you need to vote. Click the link below or scan the QR code to request a vote-by-mail ballot. Your vote can really make a difference. Thanks again, everyone.